In 1943, a book was published that captured the world's attention with its tale of life, death, and growing up. Written by an aviator and inspired by his journeys around the world, The Little Prince is an imaginative and intriguing book with a lot to say, and that's why it's managed to hold up exceptionally well since its publication. The initial blossoming of the idea came when the book's author crash-landed in the Sahara Desert, and then later events, when he moved to the United States and Canada during World War II, led to the creation of The Little Prince. For those who have not read the book, the story mostly revolves around a young prince from a very small planet who falls for a rose who suddenly bursts out of the ground. However, feeling tired of her constant begging and wanting of things, he decides to leave and travel the universe. After exploring planets occupied by adults with one-track minds and obsessions, the prince finds himself on Earth, where he meets many animals and a stranded pilot. Throughout this story, the book's author, Antoine de Saint-Exupery, managed to convey ideas in an intelligent way without talking down to the reader. One of my favorite elements of the book is how it portrays the concept of growing up and losing sight of some of the innocence of life. This is particularly emphasized by the pilot's drawing of an elephant inside of a boa constrictor, which every adult assumes is just a hat, showing the lack of imagination that can come when one grows older. Then there are the various rulers of the planets that the prince lands in, including a king obsessed with power, and an accountant too focused on money to think of anything else. The prince asks legitimate queries that a child probably would ask, and ultimately makes a lot of sense. It's not unusual for authors of children's books to question the authority of adults, but Saint-Exupery in particular seemed to have a certain disregard for them. Outside of the prince and the pilot, the animals that appear are further representations of adult and childhood. The fox just wants to hide from the hunters chasing after him, and ultimately wants to be tamed, while the snake tries to convince the prince of his power to return him home. What's most noticeable about the animals is the mutual respect they have for the prince, who is willing to listen to both of them and not assume they're just dangerous or harmless creatures. The fox in particular presented a lot of ideas and thoughts close to Saint-Exupéry's heart, as they represented the notion of human relationships. This was especially poignant considering what was happening in the world at the time. Through his adventure, the main thing on the prince's mind is a rose he left behind on his planet. Despite her constant neediness, the prince feels a certain amount of guilt for leaving her behind, and this even haunts him as he encounters a whole bevy of roses on Earth. This seems to represent the loved ones we leave behind, even though we might have a troubled relationship with them. In Saint-Exupéry's case, the rose was inspired by his wife, who was his muse, and yet he also found himself leaving her on multiple occasions to go on travels. The planet the little prince calls home also serves as an allegory to his native France, with the trees overtaking the planet being obviously inspired by the Nazi takeover of the country and the rest of Europe. It's fascinating seeing the imaginative imagery and ideas of the book, and then looking at Saint-Exupéry's biography and seeing just how much of this was inspired by his own life. The story even managed to predict his own disappearance, as Saint-Exupéry returned home and ultimately disappeared while serving in the armed forces. Similarly, the little prince decides he wants to return home by having the snake bite him, and the book ends ambiguously about whether he did get back to his home planet or died out there in the desert. Since the publication of The Little Prince, there have naturally been multiple adaptations of the book, including radio plays, animated series, and stage productions. However, I want to discuss two in particular. In 1974, Stanley Donen directed a musical film adaptation of The Little Prince, featuring songs by Leonard Lowe. For some reason, this has slipped into obscurity, which is surprising considering it's one of the most high-profile screen versions of the story, and even featured the likes of Gene Wilder and Bob Fosse in its cast list. This was actually a rather good take on the material and managed to keep a lot of the tough themes and ideas of the book intact. Despite the presence of songs, none feel out of place, and all are quite charming and memorable. I particularly have to give credit to the visuals. Donen did a wonderful job of transferring the imagery from the book to the screen, and even though this was made in the pre-Star Wars era of special effects, they hold up remarkably well, with the depictions of the planet being notable standouts. The decision to have actors play the animals seems unusual at first, but thanks to the creative costumes, Gene Wilder and Bob Fosse are believable in the parts and give them the necessary spirit and life. Of all the musical numbers, the Snake song is the showstopper, and it's not surprising Fosse provided the choreography for it. I also like the relationship between the prince and the pilot, which shows a natural progression from when they first meet to the bittersweet ending. If you get a chance to view this unappreciated little film, give it a watch sometime. It's one of those that deserves a bigger audience. A while back, it was announced that Mark Osborne, who was previously responsible for Kung Fu Panda, the Oscar-nominated short film More, and Weird Al Yankovic's Jurassic Park music video, would direct a full-length animated feature set for release this year, and I'm definitely looking forward to it. Using two interconnecting storylines, the film will have computer-generated segments of the pilot as an older man, and stop-motion scenes taken directly from the book. The film appears to have a lot of the necessary poignancy that the book is known for, and I like the direction they're taking with it by having the book adapted in flashback form, which is particularly interesting since the prince's backstory is already told with flashbacks. It's clear how much the team behind this respect the material, and I look forward to seeing the interpretation of it later this year. In conclusion, The Little Prince is a touching and thought-provoking little story that's not just a quote-unquote children's book, but something much deeper. I surprisingly only read it very recently, and if like me you never got around to it before, with a new film adaptation coming out, now's a great time to do so. See you next time.